There have been louder bosses. There have been more violent bosses. There have been bosses who made better copy for the newspapers, who gave better quotes to the FBI informants, sitting in the cars outside their social clubs, who wore better suits to better restaurants, and made sure the right people saw them doing it. Carlo Gambino was none of those things. He was a 73-year-old man who died of a heart attack in a modest house in Massapequa, Long Island, on October 15th, 1976, without a single federal conviction on his record. He had run the most powerful organized crime family in the United States for 19 years. He had done it quietly, invisibly, and without a single headline that he had not personally approved. Tonight, from FBI files, federal court records, and recognized organized crime historians, 7 reasons why Carlo Gambino was the most powerful mob boss in American history. Not the most famous, the most powerful. There is a difference, and tonight, that difference is exactly what the federal record documents. The sourcing for everything tonight comes from Selwyn Raab's 5 Families, Anthony DeStefano's The Last Godfather, and FBI File Series 92 from the New York Field Office, released under FOIA. Power here means documented, sustained control over criminal enterprises, over the commission, over federal investigations, and over the men around him. Not mythology, not film. The federal record. We start at number 7. Number 7. He arrived with nothing and built from zero. Carlo Gambino was born in Palermo, Sicily, on August 24th, 1902. He came from a family with documented ties to the Sicilian mafia, but ties mean nothing without execution. The young man who arrived illegally in the United States in 1921, entering through Norfolk, Virginia, on a merchant vessel, had no position, no crew, no patron of consequence waiting for him on the other side. He was 19 years old. He spoke limited English. He had no legal status in the country he had just entered. He had, by every documented measure, nothing. According to Selwyn Raab's 5 Families, Gambino made his way to Brooklyn and inserted himself into the lower rungs of the Morello crime family structure, one of the predecessor organizations to the 5 Families that would be formally established a decade later. He started as an associate, then a soldier. He ran errands. He collected debts. He drove. He listened. He did not complain, did not argue with men above him, did not draw attention to himself in any direction. In a world where most young men announce their ambitions loudly, Gambino kept his entirely to himself. What separated Gambino from the hundreds of other young Sicilian immigrants who entered similar criminal structures in the same decade was patience combined with an extraordinary capacity for institutional memory. Anthony DeStefano's research in The Last Godfather documents that men who dealt with Gambino in those early years described him consistently as careful, observant, someone who remembered every face, every debt, every favor, and who acted on none of it until the moment was exactly right. In an environment where most men acted quickly and paid for it with their freedom or their lives, Gambino acted slowly and built from it. He survived the Castellammare War of 1930 to 31. He survived the Mangano years. He survived the Anastasia years. He survived the chaotic aftermath of the 1957 Appalachian Meeting, when the entire federal apparatus turned toward organized crime with new intensity. Every boss around him fell, was imprisoned, or was killed. Carlo Gambino kept rising. The man who would eventually control New York started with nothings and no one. That is the foundation of everything that follows on this list. Number 6. He turned the Anastasia hit into a coronation. By the mid-1950s, Carlo Gambino was the underboss of the family run by Albert Anastasia, the former commander of Murder Incorporated, responsible by FBI assessment for an estimated 400 contract killings between 1931 and 1940. Anastasia was feared across every family in the country. He was also, by 1957, a documented liability that the entire structure could no longer afford to carry. The problem was not his violence. Violence was the business. The problem was his judgment. He was accepting payments from men seeking to become made members without commission approval, a direct breach of the protocols Lucky Luciano had established in 1931. He was ordering unsanctioned killings. He had ordered the murder of Arnold Schuster, a civilian who had identified bank robber Willie Sutton on a New York subway platform, simply because he had seen Schuster's face on television and was irritated by him. According to Selwyn Rabb's 5 families, that killing enraged the commission. Civilians were not targets. The rule existed precisely to prevent the kind of sustained law enforcement pressure that civilian murders guaranteed. By 1957, multiple senior figures across the 5 families had concluded that Anastasia's continued existence threatened the entire structure. Gambino's response was characteristically invisible. According to Rabb and FBI files released under FOIA, Gambino quietly built an alliance with Vito Genovese, the ambitious underboss of what had been the Luciano family, who was himself positioning for dominance. The 2 men reached a common calculation. Anastasia had to go, and the man who emerged from the aftermath in the strongest position would be the man who had laid the groundwork most carefully in the months before. On October 25th, 1957, 2 men in dark suits walked into the Park Sheraton Hotel barbershop on 7th Avenue in Manhattan and put 8 bullets into Albert Anastasia in chair number 4. The gunmen were never officially identified. The murder was never federally prosecuted. The investigation produced nothing. Carlo Gambino was recognized by the commission as the new boss of the family within weeks. He had not fired a weapon. He had not made a public statement. He had built the right relationships, identified the right moment, and positioned himself so that when the chair became vacant, his name was the only name on the table. According to Anthony DeStefano, Gambino emerged from the aftermath not as a suspect, not as a participant, but as the solution to the problem Anastasia had created. He was 55 years old when he became boss. He would hold that position for 19 uninterrupted years. No other New York boss of the post-war era came close to that tenure. Number 5, he built the most profitable criminal empire in New York history. The Gambino family, under Carlo Gambino, was not the most violent organization in New York. It was the most profitable. That distinction reflects a deliberate strategic choice that the federal record documents in full detail. According to FBI surveillance files from the 1960s and 1970s, released under FOIA, the Gambino family simultaneously controlled construction union racketeering across all 5 boroughs, extracting tribute from contractors on every major building project in the city. No major construction project in New York in the 1960s or 1970s moved forward without tribute, flowing upward through the family structure. Waterfront operations at the Red Hook and Gowanus Piers in Brooklyn, garment district labor racketeering in Manhattan, extracting tribute from the trucking and shipping operations that served the largest garment manufacturing center in the United States, illegal gambling across Brooklyn, Queens, and Staten Island, loan sharking networks extending across the entire northeastern United States, documented in cooperator testimony across multiple subsequent federal prosecutions, and, according to federal indictments brought after Gambino's death, significant involvement in the stolen securities trade operating out of Lower Manhattan brokerage houses, an operation the FBI documented as generating tens of millions of dollars across the late 1960s and early 1970s. Selwyn Rabb's 5 families estimates the Gambino family's annual revenue during Gambino's peak years in the hundreds of millions of dollars. At the time of his death in 1976, the family generated more annual revenue than many publicly traded American corporations of the era. The victims of these operations are not famous. They are the business owners who paid extortion on their loading docks and their construction sites, the union members whose pension funds were systematically looted across decades with no legal recourse available to them, the individuals trapped in loan sharking arrangements where the terms were enforced not by courts but by violence. They number in the tens of thousands across 19 years. They are in the federal record, in cooperator testimony, in indictments brought against Gambino family members across the 1980s and 1990s. They are the actual human cost of the operation. Carlo Gambino ran from his modest house in Massapequa. Number 4, he controlled the commission itself. The commission was, in theory, a collective body. The 5 New York families plus representation from Chicago and other major outfits, with no single figure holding formal authority above the others. Lucky Luciano had deliberately abolished the title of Capo di tutti capi, precisely because no family would accept one man formally above the rest. In theory, the commission was a council of equals. In practice, according to Selwyn Rabb's 5 families and to the sworn testimony of cooperating witnesses in the 1985 commission case, United States versus Salerno, prosecuted by then U.S. Attorney Rudy Giuliani, Carlo Gambino functioned as the dominant figure on the commission from approximately 1962 until his death in 1976. Not through formal title, through a combination of assets no other boss could match simultaneously, the largest and most profitable family in New York. Relationships cultivated over 40 years across every family and every major outfit in the country. Built on kept promises and a reputation the federal record documents consistently. And a specific form of political intelligence, the ability to identify the point of agreement in any dispute before either side had fully articulated it, and to position himself as the natural mediator through whom that agreement flowed. FBI surveillance files from the late 1960s and early 1970s document Gambino meeting with bosses from Chicago, Philadelphia, Detroit, Cleveland, and New England, meetings that other bosses sought out rather than Gambino initiating. According to Anthony DeStefano, the phrase that appeared repeatedly in FBI surveillance reports was that other bosses wanted Gambino's blessing before major decisions, not his permission, his blessing. He had made himself the man whose approval mattered without ever formally claiming the authority that would have made him a visible target for federal prosecution. The 1985 commission case established in federal court what the FBI had documented for decades. Gambino was 9 years dead by then, but the structure the prosecution documented, resulting in convictions for the sitting bosses of 4 of the 5 New York families, was substantially the structure Carlo Gambino had built and dominated for 19 years. Number 3, he survived every federal investigation. The FBI began seriously investigating Carlo Gambino in the early 1960s, following the reorganization of federal organized crime priorities under Attorney General Robert Kennedy in the aftermath of the Valachi testimony and the Appalachian meeting. For the next 15 years, the New York field office dedicated significant and sustained resources to building a prosecutable case against him. After 15 years of that effort, they had almost nothing that would hold up in front of a jury. FBI File Series 92 contains years of surveillance reports, wiretap transcripts, informant debriefings, and photographic records on Gambino. The files confirm his position, his relationships, his role in commission decisions, his control over revenue streams. What they do not contain, what 15 years of sustained federal surveillance failed to generate, was direct evidence of specific criminal conduct sufficient to support a prosecution the government was confident it could win at trial. Gambino's method was disciplined to the point of being institutional. He never said anything incriminating on a telephone. This was not paranoia. It was policy, understood and followed throughout the entire organization. He communicated in person, in settings he controlled, with men he had known for decades. He gave direction in language, never explicit enough to constitute actionable evidence of specific criminal instruction. He maintained layers of insulation between himself and the operations he controlled, layers of capos and soldiers who received and executed direction without it ever being traceable back to him in a form a federal prosecutor could take before a jury. The closest the government came was the 1970 stolen securities conspiracy charge. A federal grand jury in the Eastern District of New York indicted Gambino on charges carrying substantial prison exposure. Before trial, Gambino suffered a serious documented heart attack. His physicians submitted medical documentation of severe cardiac. The Justice Department allowed the case to be resolved without incarceration. He was never imprisoned. 19 years as boss of the most scrutinized organized crime family in America, with the full resources of the FBI's New York field office directed at him. Carlo Gambino never spent a single night in federal prison. That is not an accident. It is the result of a specific, disciplined operational methodology that the FBI itself recorded across 30 years of surveillance files and never found a way to break. Number 2, he made a succession decision that shaped the next decade. In the final years of his life, as his cardiac condition deteriorated through 1975 and into 1976, Carlo Gambino made the decision that would define the family for the next decade and produce the most famous federal organized crime prosecution in American history. The expected successor was Agnello Della Croce, the underboss, a man who had served loyally and effectively for years, who commanded deep respect across the family's street crews, and who had the organizational support, the seniority, and the operational track record the position demanded. According to Selwyn Rabb's 5 Families, Della Croce himself expected to become boss. The men around him expected it. The family's structure pointed toward it. Gambino chose Paul Castellano instead. Castellano was his brother-in-law and was oriented toward the white-collar revenue streams, construction, garbage hauling, meat distribution, that Gambino himself had always prioritized. Gambino's calculation was that Castellano would run the family as a business and maintain the low profile that had kept it out of the crosshairs of escalating RICO prosecutions. It was a calculation rooted in the same logic that had governed Gambino's entire career. Keep it quiet, keep it profitable, stay out of the newspapers. The calculation was wrong. Della Croce accepted the decision, but the resentment within the family was documented by FBI surveillance almost immediately. The split between the Castellano and Della Croce factions ran as a structural fault line through the entire organization for 9 years. When Della Croce died of cancer on December 2nd, 1985, the faction he had held in check made its move within 2 weeks. On December 16th, 1985, Paul Castellano and his driver, Thomas Bellotti, were shot outside Sparks Steakhouse on East 46th Street in Midtown Manhattan. The man who ordered that killing, according to the federal indictment in United States v. Gotti and to the sworn testimony of Sammy Gravano, was a Gambino family capo named John Gotti. Gotti's rise, his 3 federal acquittals, and his eventual 1992 conviction on racketeerings and murder charges all flow directly from the succession decision Carlo Gambino made from his sickbed in Massapequa in 1976. A dying man in a modest Long Island house made a single personnel decision that set in motion a chain of events culminating in the most covered organized crime prosecution in the history of American television. Gambino did not intend this outcome, but the federal record establishes it as the direct consequence of his final major decision as boss. Number 1, he died. Free Carlo Gambino, dying free, in his own bed, of natural causes, without a federal conviction, without a prison sentence, without even a pending indictment on October 15th, 1976, is the number 1 entry on this list, not because it is admirable. It is here because among the bosses of major American organized crime families in the 20th century, it is essentially unique, and the federal record, examined carefully, explains precisely why. Consider the documented fates of the men around him. Vito Genovese, convicted on federal narcotics charges in 1959, sentenced to 15 years, died in the federal penitentiary in Springfield, Missouri, in February 1969. He was 71 years old. Lucky Luciano, convicted by Thomas Dewey in 1936, sentenced to 30 to 50 years, deported to Italy in 1946, died in Naples in January 1962, never permitted to return to the country he had spent his adult life operating in. Frank Costello, convicted of tax evasion in 1954, years of federal legal proceedings consuming the final decades of his operational life. Joe Bonanno, exiled by the Commission in 1964, years under federal investigation. Albert Anastasia, murdered 1957. Paul Castellano, murdered 1985. John Gotti, convicted 1992, died in the United States Medical Center for Federal Prisoners in Springfield, Missouri, in June 2002. He was 61 years old. The pattern across the entire generation is consistent and unambiguous. The bosses who were visible, who made headlines, who gave federal prosecutors actionable evidence, who alienated the commission or destabilized their own organizations, they ended their lives in prison, in exile, or violently. Every one of them. Carlo Gambino ended his in a modest house on Long Island, surrounded by his family, of a heart attack at 73 years old, with no federal proceedings pending against him. According to Anthony DeStefano's The Last Godfather, FBI agents who had worked the Gambino investigation for years were asked after his death what they would have done differently. The consistent answer was that there was no clear answer. He had given them almost nothing usable across 30 years of sustained surveillance. He had run a criminal organization that the FBI's own files documented as the most powerful in the country, and he had done it in a way that produced almost no prosecutable evidence against the man at the top. Selwyn Rabb's assessment in 5 Families is the most precise the record offers. Gambino understood, at a level almost no other boss of his era matched, that the organization was the instrument and invisibility was the method. He was not the organization's public face. He was the quiet man at the center who made the decisions and left no fingerprints, who went home to a modest house in Massapequa, drove an unremarkable car, wore inexpensive clothes, went to church, attended family gatherings, and was to every outward observer simply an elderly Sicilian-American man who kept to himself and caused no trouble. He ran the most powerful organized crime family in America for 19 years. He died free. No other boss of his generation managed both. It bears stating clearly, as this channel states on every episode, the men of the Gambino family and of American organized crime represented a tiny criminal minority within the Italian-American community of their era. The millions of Italian Americans who came to this country in the same decades as Carlo Gambino built this country's infrastructure, served in its military, through 2 world wars, founded its institutions, and raised generations of Americans whose lives have nothing to do with the federal record documented tonight. The Commission files documents organized crime. It does not document the Italian-American community. Those are not the same subject, and they never were. Carlo Gambino died on October 15th, 1976. He was 73 years old. The family he left behind would go on to produce the most famous federal organized crime prosecution in American history, the conviction of John Gotti in 1992. That story is coming. Organized crime built its empire in the dark. Federal prosecutors and historians spent decades dragging it into the light. The Commission files exist to document what they found, not to glorify it, not to bury it, but to remember it. New episode next Tuesday. Sources for everything covered tonight are in the description. This has been The Commission Files. Good night from the archive.